Welcome Ben Macintyre and Johan Sorensen.
Hello.
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 Oh, it works? It works?
Perfect. Can you hear us at the back? More or less?
More or less.
Good.
So I'm here to... Ben Macintyre is esteemed associate editor at The Times.
Yep.
The Times being the one in London. The Times. And best-selling international author of many books. How many books?
I think I'm up to 12 now.
12.
Too many.
Probably the man with the most kind of unfettered access to the darker side or more creative side of British government and war efforts. And today you're going to talk about Operation Mincemeat, which is definitely a case of truth being stranger than fiction.
Yes, it's probably the oddest intelligence operation ever launched, but also one of the most successful. Most intelligence, it seems to me, doesn't really make much difference. That one side spies on the other, and they have spies in their camp, and we have spies in their camp, and they have spies in ours, and in the end it doesn't really amount to anything. Operation Mincemeat was different. Operation Mincemeat actually changed the course of the Second World War, and it was a tremendous gamble. And as you rightly say, it is stranger than fiction, but largely because it was sort of born in fiction. I mean, the thing I love about Operation Mincemeat is it was dreamed up by one novelist based on having read a novel. It was then passed to two frustrated novelists who then cooked it up. It was then put into action by a poet and a novelist. And the only reason it ever came to light after the war was because yet another novelist heard about it and wrote a novel that then forced the government to release the files. So it is a sort of fiction, but it's true.
Even the names within it couldn't really be made up.
Yes, I mean, Operation Mincemeat itself, I probably need to do a bit of background before we get to why that is such a strange title for it. Operation Mincemeat took place mostly in 1943. And to paint a little sort of strategic picture, 160,000 Allied troops were massed in North Africa after Operation Torch, which was the landing in North Africa, to begin the invasion of Europe. And everybody knew the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe was coming. The Germans knew it, the Allies knew it, everybody knew it. But the key question was where it was coming, because the Mediterranean is a pretty big spot, and there were various different areas where this invasion could take place. The obvious place to land was the island of Sicily, because occupied obviously by the Italians, allied to the Germans, it controlled the central Mediterranean. If you controlled the airfields on Sicily, you controlled the Mediterranean. So that was the obvious target for this huge armada that was massing in North Africa. So the job of British intelligence and Western intelligence, or in this case almost entirely British, was to try to convince Hitler that instead of landing in Sicily, this vast body of troops were in fact aiming for Greece in the eastern Mediterranean and Sardinia in the west. So there was a huge deception operation called Operation Bodyguard, which involved all sorts of different elements of deception, including kind of inflatable tanks and totally fake armies and lots of false radio traffic. But at its heart was this operation, Operation Mincemeat, which was dreamed up by Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond books, who was at that time a junior intelligence officer in naval intelligence. And he was asked by his boss, a sort of hard-driving boss called John Godfrey, who was the model for M, by the way, in the James Bond stories, was asked to come up with a series of ruses that could be used to baffle the enemy. And he came up with a long list in a thing called the Trout Memo. And number 28 on the list was what he called a suggestion, brackets, not a very nice one. And his suggestion was, let's get hold of a dead body, let's create an entirely new and completely fake personality for this body, let's plant false papers on him, ship him somewhere where the Germans will find him, and these false papers, which will look like military papers, will give the impression that the landings are going to take place in Greece and Sardinia. So that's the core of what became Operation Mincemeat. And it was called Mincemeat largely because they thought that was just quite a funny joke, that you would take a dead body and call it mincemeat. One of the rules in the Second World War was that no code name should give any kind of indication about what the operation or mission was really about. And this rule was broken routinely by everybody on every side all the time, because no one could quite resist having a code name that gave at least a sort of nudging hint about what... I mean, the code for example, the German code for Britain was Golfplatz, golf course, because that's what it looked like when you flew over in a Luftwaffe plane. So there we are. That's the origins of mincemeat. Yeah.
Maybe talk. I'd love to come back to sort of how you convince Hitler. But for anyone who hasn't read the book, could you talk us through some of the twists and turns?
Okay, so having this plan was approved by a group within British intelligence called the Double Cross Committee, or rather it was called the 20 Committee. Because another joke that they rather liked, a 20 in Roman numerals is 2 crosses, so it was the Double Cross Committee. And their job was to feed disinformation and misinformation to the enemy through double agents. That was essentially what they did. And they gave approval to this plan, and 2 intelligence officers by the splendid names of Charles Chumley and Ewan Montague, who one was an RAF officer with a moustache that long, sort of curled up at the ends, and the other one was a very hard-driving Jewish lawyer called Ewan Montague. And they, between them, began to cook up this plan. Now, you'd think trying to get hold of a dead body in the middle of a war would be quite easy. I mean, Britain was under attack, the Blitz was going on, but in fact, finding the right kind of body turned out to be quite tricky, because it had to look like a body that had died in an air accident. That was the plan. The idea was that the body would be made to look as if there had been a sort of air crash over the Mediterranean and then this body had simply washed up on shore. There was a precedent for this, actually, because in fact, slightly earlier in the war, there had been an air crash in which an airman had been washed ashore, and it did end up, by a slightly complicated route, in the hands of German intelligence. The papers in that case didn't really make any difference because they weren't that important. And that was really one of the other germs for Operation Mincemeat. So the first thing they had to do was to try and find a body in wartime London. And so they began to sort of ask around, and it was quite tricky to find the right sort of body because it had to look right. So they applied in the end to a friend of Montague's who was the coroner at St Pancras, who was a man, the names in this story are rather splendid. His name was Sir Bentley Purchase. And I slightly wonder what happened to all those people called Chumley and Purchase and Montague. I think they weren't really breeding types, actually.
No.
You don't really find them today, I can tell you. And Bentley Purchase, who was a very cheerful coroner, a man who dealt with the dead all the time, but had a tremendous sense of humour, sent a note back to Montague saying, "By all means come and see me. The quickest way to get to me is to get yourself run over." So Montague turned up, and Purchase said to him, it actually took quite a long time, after about a month, Purchase called him up and said, "Look, I think I've got the right candidate here." And what had happened was a young man called Glendower Michael, who was a Welsh miner. He was probably mentally ill. He was certainly an alcoholic. Had died in a warehouse in King's Cross. And we don't quite know how Glendower Michael died. It's probable that he died from ingesting rat poison. Whether he did it as an act of suicide or whether it was an accident because he ate bread that had been laced with poison to kill the rats in the warehouse, we don't really know. His is a very tragic story, and it really only came to light very recently. In fact, just before, when I was doing the research for this book, MI5 accidentally released his name, and the accident is an interesting one in some ways. This body, Purchase said, had arrived in the mortuary. No one had arrived to claim it. He appeared to have, well, Bentley Purchase said he had no living relatives, which wasn't actually true. He did have living relatives who turned up later in the story. But as far as anybody was concerned, this looked like it was a free body. And so British intelligence stole it. It was completely illegal. You're not allowed to steal dead bodies. But that's what they did, and so they kept him on ice, but in St Pancras mortuary. The problem was bodies do decompose even when they're kept on ice, particularly in 1943. So that the clock was beginning to tick, and Bentley Purchase, who was was sort of brought into the secret, warned them that they really only had about a month to get this thing ready. And so they set about creating a completely fictional person. They created William Martin of the Royal Marines. They decided that William Martin, this completely fake person, would be a courier. He would be a sort of high-grade intelligence courier. And obviously the most important thing about William Martin was that he had to carry high-level intelligence documents. So they had to do two things at once, really. One is that they had to start faking up documents that would appear to indicate an invasion where no invasion was going to take place. And at the same time, they had to create a new personality for somebody with a blank slate. And as I think I said at the beginning, they kind of set about this as if they were novelists, really. And so they invented for William Martin a new personality. They invented for him a girlfriend, for a start. They decided, if you look in your pockets, you'll contend, you may not know it, but you have something that the intelligence services called pocket litter. Now, pocket litter is the stuff that we all carry with us all the time that give little indications about who we are and where we come from. Today, it's much easier because we've all got iPhones, so you would just look on one of those. But in those days, what you carried on your wallet would say they calculated a lot about who you were. So they began to assemble little bits and pieces that would, they hoped, end up in the hands of German intelligence and persuade them that this was a real person. And so they began collecting things like a receipt for an engagement ring that he was supposed to have bought for his girlfriend Pam, who didn't exist. They inserted letters from the bank manager demanding that he pay an overdraft. They inserted theatre ticket stubs and a bus ticket and bits of loose change and a pair of cufflinks and all the little bits and pieces. But of course, because they were thoroughly, as you can tell, they were thoroughly enjoying Operation Mincemeat, they went completely over the top.
Maybe got a bit carried away.
They got totally carried away and began creating a kind of, it's almost like, I've never written any novels, but if you do, it must be quite difficult to know where to stop. And so one of the things they did was they decided to hold a kind of impromptu beauty contest in the basement of MI5 in order to get hold of a photograph of a young woman who would be this imaginary girlfriend to go in the pocket litter. This was really done because Ewan Montague rather fancied one of the secretaries and wanted to see if he could get her to produce a photograph of herself in a bathing costume. And so they held this thing, and they all produced lots and lots of photographs. And the person selected, who I interviewed shortly before she died, who was wonderful, was called Joan. And she said, oh, yes, so I knew exactly what he was up to. And so she produced this photograph of herself bathing in Whittenham Clumps, which is near London. And they included, along with this, a series of love letters. And I thought I might just, to give you a little flavour of what they were up to, just read you a little bit of one of the letters. And I suppose I should probably read this in the accent of Celia Johnson, but I won't try. I do think, dearest, that this is handwritten, okay, on a letter that is supposed to give the Germans the idea that this is a real story. I do think, dearest, that seeing people like you off at railway stations is one of the poorer forms of sport. A train goes out and can leave a howling great gap in one's life, and one had to try madly and quite in vain to fill it with all the things one used to enjoy a short 5 weeks ago. I mean, it's completely overwritten. But it also says, there's a little hint of what is coming here. Bill, darling, don't forget that William Martin is this fake character. Bill, darling, do let me know as soon as you get fixed and can make some more plans. And please don't let them send you off into the blue the horrible way they do nowadays. Now that we've found each other out of the whole world, I don't think I could bear it. And don't forget, this is a character who's going to wash up dead very soon on the shores of Spain. So they're kind of cooking what feels like a sort of B-grade movie here.
And that letter was written by Pam? By Joan?
No, the letter, marvellously, was written by a secretary in MI5 called Hester Leggett, who was unmarried and rather lovelorn. And she poured her heart into it. There are a whole series of them, and they're some of the most moving documents you could ever read. So as you can tell, everybody in this office, in room 13 of the Admiralty, is getting completely...
Very professional.
Very
They're
professional.
Very British.
They're really getting completely over the top about this. Then the next issue is that they have to get these documents into the hands of the Germans. Now, how do you do that? They worked out that Spain was neutral in the Second World War, as you probably all know, but the Spanish bureaucracy, and particularly the police, were leaning towards the Nazis. Most of the Spanish government was very pro-German. And the British intelligence had worked out, largely through the Bletchley Park intercepts, the Enigma code breaking that allowed British intelligence to read German intelligence mail, effectively. They worked out there was one particular spy, a German spy, who was operating on the coast of Spain near Huelva. And he was extremely efficient, quite gullible, and absolutely right to try and get this stuff into his hands. So what they worked out was that he'd also bribed this character, had bribed the local Spanish police in Huelva. So they were all in his pocket. So they worked out if they could get the body there, near him, the Spanish police would pick up these documents, and with a bit of luck, they would pass them to this German spy, and then with a lot more luck, that might work its way all the way up to Hitler's desk. I mean, you can imagine how long a shot this is, and also how dangerous it is, because if the Germans were to rumble that this was a deception, and to realize that everything this courier was carrying was false, okay, they would then realize that it was the opposite of the truth. And that therefore, if these forgeries were trying to persuade them that Greece and Sardinia were the targets, and Sicily wasn't, then Sicily was the target, and Greece and Sardinia couldn't be. So the stakes here really couldn't have been higher. 150,000 men are going to land on Sicily, and if the Germans rumble Operation Mincemeat, the Germans are going to be waiting. I mean, the Germans...
The British had estimates for the number of deaths and ships and all the rest of it, didn't they?
They did, and
in that scenario?
They did, and they were pretty high. I mean, there were 160,000 people going in. They thought they would probably, if the Germans knew they were coming, it was quite likely the invasion would just fail completely. It's very hard to land an amphibious invasion. And the chances against it were extremely high. So while this story has its ridiculous and comic aspects, it's also very serious, because it's really the pivotal deception of the central part of the war. And if the invasion of Sicily fails, then the invasion of Italy is going to be impossible. And if Italy is not successfully invaded, then Fortress Europe, as Hitler described it, would remain unvanquished. It would, the whole course of the war would have been different. So there are critically important bits and pieces here.
So it was a foolproof plan.
No, it
thoroughly worked through.
It was an enormous gamble. And to this day, I'm not quite sure how or why they got permission to do it, because it was such a long shot, and the stakes were, as I say, incredibly high. But amazingly, that they did. They were allowed to go ahead with it. And so they took Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. They dressed him in a Marine's uniform. They decided that Charles Cholmondeley would have to wear the uniform for a couple of weeks beforehand so that it looked properly used when they put it on him. And then they put him in a van.
They did put underpants on him.
They put underpants on him. They got they got exactly the right sort of underpants, which they got a military issue underpants. I mean, they went to incredible detail on all of this. In some ways, some of it was a real hostage to fortune. And they made one huge mistake, which could have, I'll come to that in a moment. But yes, no, they dressed him up completely. And they built a special canister to carry him in. And the diagram for it is in the book. And in fact, I built a replica. I did a documentary for the BBC a few years ago about Operation Mincemeat. And we built a replica canister, which it's a sort of long thing with a sort of hinge, which they packed with dry ice to try and keep him cool. And then they drove him to Scotland in the back of a van and put him on a submarine, HMS Seraph. And the idea was that the submarine would take him to the coast of Spain, take him out of the canister, float him face downwards with a Mae West life jacket on, and hoped that the tide would just bring him ashore. And that is what happened. They loaded him into one of the torpedo tubes in HMS Seraph. Nobody on board, except the captain, Bill Jewell, knew what was actually in the canister, although in retrospect, quite a few of the ratings said afterwards that was a very smelly canister. I think some of them undoubtedly knew there was something very odd going on even before they got to the coast of Huelva. They arrived on the coast of Spain. They took the canister up on deck. The captain had by this point informed 3 of the men on board what was actually happening. They didn't know why, but they knew that this body was about to be shipped off. And there's a rather moving moment in the story when they take the body of Glendower Michael, this kind of homeless tramp, and set him afloat. And there's absolutely no guarantee this is going to work at all. There's rather a moving moment where they kind of they read a little sort of biblical passage as he floats ashore in the sort of dawn light, in the Spanish dawn light, and it's a kind of critical moment in the story because nobody has any idea whether this is going to work or not.
And they don't actually find out for a while.
Well, no. I mean, as with all good stories, it first of all goes completely wrong. The body goes ashore. It's spotted by the sardine fishermen who operated in that part of Huelva. And they bring it ashore, and the police pick it up. And the first thing the police do, somewhat to the horror of the people who are running, I mean, the British have agents who are waiting on shore. Because the theory is that with a bit of luck, this briefcase that is chained to the hand of the dead body,
Which is not standard procedure, right?
No. That again, they had to kind of violate the rules. I mean, they were very worried that if they simply put the briefcase carrying the documents into his hand, it would just float away. There's no way that it would be clear that it had come from him. So they chained it to him like a bank manager. With a sort of special chain that ran up his arm and then down and attached to his waist, which was fine, except that couriers didn't do that. I mean, you know, couriers in the Second World War carried briefcases in a normal way. So that was one of the hostages to fortune. That was one of the things that the Germans could have spotted that and said, there's something wrong about this. He floats ashore. He's taken to the autopsy in the local village.
Which they were convinced that there were no competent people to perform an autopsy in Spain because they were Spanish.
Yes. I mean, yes. In order to convince them, well, they didn't have to convince themselves. They were worried initially that because this body had died from rat poison, that a decent post-mortem investigation would reveal that it hadn't died at sea, this poor chap, but he'd been poisoned. And then that might set alarm bells off. So they consulted a man called Sir Bernard Spilsbury, who was, I missed this part of the story, who was one of the great fathers of forensic medicine. He was a brilliant forensic pathologist, but he was also very pompous and convinced that he was right about all things. And he said to them, and this is a direct quote, he said, in order to identify this body as having been poisoned, you would have to find a pathologist who is as good as me, and there aren't any in Spain. And he was completely wrong about that, actually, because A, there were very good pathologists around in Spain, and B, if a body's been poisoned by rat poison, you can work it out pretty quickly. So that, as you can tell, there are a number of hostages to fortune here. So the body went ashore, the autopsy began, a man from the British consulate was summoned to attend the autopsy, who was in fact himself a British spy. He was a man called Gomez Baer. And he was in on the plot. So he arrived at the autopsy in this boiling day, in the boiling heat, and the smell was appalling. And the worst thing that could possibly happen, was that the presiding police officer picked up the briefcase and handed it to the consul and said, "You might as well take this back. It'll save a lot of red tape, because really it's boring."
Which they're supposed to do. They're supposed to give.
Well, the idea was that it would stay in Spanish police hands for long enough for the bribed Spanish police to hand it to the Germans, and that didn't happen. It was handed straight back to the consul, who then had to say, "No thanks, no thanks, old chap. You hang on to it. I think we'd better go through the right procedures." Sweating horribly, thinking this whole thing's going to go wrong at the beginning. So the police officers took it back and said, "All right, we'll hang on to it." And then, sure enough, this German spy, Adolf Klaus he was called, got wind of the fact that a British courier had washed ashore in Huelva. And through a long and tortuous process, the body obviously stayed in Huelva and was buried in Huelva, and indeed remains in the churchyard in Huelva. I've been to the graveyard. It's actually rather a touching spot. And this body, I mean, Glyndwr Michael, is buried under this headstone that says, Captain William Martin of the Royal Marines washed up on, July, whatever it was, 1943. But rather sweetly, there's now an addendum added to it. There's been a bit sort of nailed on the bottom which says, real name Glyndwr Michael. So finally, he has been identified. The body is in there. So the body stays there, and the briefcase begins this extraordinary passage, sort of up Spain, really. I mean, it's heading towards Madrid, because it's now in the hands of the Spanish Navy. Because he was a naval officer, it was handed over to the Navy. Now, the Navy was slightly less corrupted than the police. So it wasn't really working this. It wasn't being handed to the Germans properly. And Adolf Klaus followed it up Spain, trying to kind of keep track of where it was going. And it ended up in the hands of the Spanish security service, some of whom were very pro-fascist. And finally, one of those Spanish security officers, contacted the head of intelligence, head of German intelligence in Madrid. It was a man called Kuhlenthal, who was, interestingly, Jewish, in fact. He'd been Aryanized by the head of the German intelligence service to kind of protect him, really. And he was, in a way, the ideal Mark, Kuhlenthal, because he was desperate to believe and desperate for a sort of success. And he handed the documents over to German intelligence. Now, one of the wrinkles in this story was that in order for it to work, the Germans had to believe that they had read the intelligence in them, in these documents, and returned them to the British without the British realizing that that is what had happened. Because, of course, if the Germans knew that the British had found out that their documents had been found, they might change their plans. So in order for the whole thing to work, the documents have to go back to the British in such a way that they look as if they haven't been read. So this is what they did. The key documents were put in envelopes, inside embossed, sealed envelopes, so old-fashioned envelopes, so it's that thick paper with a big seal on the back of them, a big wax seal. They used special ink that they knew would not run in the time that the body was at sea, because it was only in the water for 12 hours or whatever. So what the Spanish did, so it was initially the Spanish who took the documents out and then handed them on. If you look at an old-fashioned envelope, there's a special prong you can use in intelligence to take a letter out of an envelope. Try this. If it's sealed, if you seal it on the bottom, if you bend the envelope like that and you can insert a double prong into the top, you can snag the top of the letter, wind it up like that until it becomes a little cylinder, and then you can pull it out of the top without actually breaking the seal. It's a really difficult thing to do. I've tried it lots of times. You can do it. It's very, very hard to take a letter out that way. It's even harder to get it back in again. Because that's what they had to do. They had to not only take it out without breaking the seal, they had to then put it back in such a way that the Germans would, it could appear to the Brits that it hadn't been read. The other thing they did was they put one single eyelash inside the envelope, inside the folded letter, on the understanding that if it was opened, then the eyelash would fall out, and it would be clear when the stuff eventually returns back to Britain that it had actually been read. Okay? It gets quite complicated, this. So at that point, we're now, what date? I can't remember what date we are now, but this stuff has been in German-Spanish hands for about 2 weeks, and the Brits are getting really worried because they don't know if it's got into the German hands yet. So they decide to accelerate the process a bit. So they knew that the telephones inside the British embassy in Madrid were bugged. They knew that the Germans were eavesdropping on them. So a series of frantic telephone calls began to take place between London and Madrid that roughly went as follows. We've lost some very, very important documents somewhere on the coast of Spain. You've got to start trying to get them back, knowing that the Germans would pick this up on their eavesdropping system, and then it would accelerate their interest in getting hold of these documents. So Finally, these documents are copied. I've seen the copies, in fact. They're photographed in the basement of the German embassy in Madrid. The photographs are loaded onto a Luftwaffe plane, which then flies to Berlin. And they do eventually end up on Hitler's desk, but not before they go through the hands of another key character in here, who was a man called Alexis von Werner. Which time have we got? Okay, so von Werner is a critical figure in this story, because von Werner was the head of German analysis for the Abwehr, which was the German intelligence service. And he was a brilliant man. And he was in charge of deciding what intelligence was usable and what isn't. And these documents, appearing to show that there was about to be an invasion of Greece and Sardinia, landed on his desk. He read them. He read them very carefully. And he then drew up a report, which he sent to Hitler, which said, these documents are clearly completely genuine. There is absolutely no reason to disbelieve anything that is in here. So clearly, the invasion is not going to be in Sicily. And I'm paraphrasing here. The invasion is not going to be in Sicily. It's going to be in Greece and Sardinia. He added elements to that report that were not in the letters. I mean, he actually made them sound more believable than they really were. Now, why did he do that? The answer is that Alexis von Werner was actually part of the anti-Hitler conspiracy. Von Werner was part of the July plot. And there's a very good case to be made that not only was he working against Hitler, but that he knew these documents were fake. But he decided not to reveal the fact that he knew they were fake because he realized it would work against Hitler. It's impossible to prove this. It's purely circumstantial because poor old Alexis von Werner, after the July plot, was rounded up with the rest of the July plotters and executed in Plötzensee prison. He was clearly anti-Hitler. So there's a good case to be made that the Germans believed this stuff because at least some of them wanted to believe it, knowing that it was false.
Yet there was someone who did doubt it.
There was. The chief doubter was Goebbels. Yes, Goebbels, the propaganda minister, who was no fool, actually. I mean, one of the most evil human beings who has ever lived, but a man of high intelligence. And he read these documents, and he said, I mean, it is a truism of intelligence, that if something looks perfect, if something looks absolutely ideal, it's probably a fake. And he took a look at this stuff, and he said, I don't like the smell of this at all. It's too complete. There's nothing wrong with it at all. Life doesn't really work like that. Real life doesn't work like that. We always make mistakes. There are kind of elements that don't fit together. The truth is they had, in fact, missed a critical clue, which was that one of the theatre stubs that was included in his pocket litter was actually of a date that was too late for him to have died in an air crash. They actually got one of the dates wrong. The Germans missed it completely. But Montague and Cholmondeley realized as the body was going ashore that actually what they'd done was that there was a big error inside it, that if the Germans rumbled it, the whole thing was going to go to hell in a handcart. So there's actually quite a funny moment in room 13 where they're all staring at each other thinking, this is not going to work. And what's worse is we are going to tip off the Germans to the fact that the invasion is going to be in Sicily. Now, that didn't happen because the Germans, either through intention or by mistake, missed this vital clue. And it worked. I mean, the astonishing thing about Operation Mincemeat is that it worked beyond anybody's expectations. It's impossible to prove, because, of course, you can't quantify these things, how many lives were saved by mincemeat. But when the moment of the invasion came, Italy was very lightly defended, and it's clear from the way that Hitler disposed of his troops around the Mediterranean that he believed the invasion was not going to come in Sicily. I mean, this is provable because Bletchley Park, the Enigma codebreakers, intercepted all the intelligence analysis that was going on at the time, and it's absolutely clear that the pattern showed that, as Montague wrote in a triumphant telegram to Churchill, mincemeat swallowed whole. They fell for it. I mean, it's certainly the oddest, but it was probably the most successful wartime deception ever attempted.
I mean, I'm interested by the kind of two parts of it. I read through this book, and it's clearly the kind of the person who wins is, you know, the one who knows that the other one knows that the other one knows that they think they know, that kind of endless intelligence circle. But also that so many things could go wrong with it, yet they seem to be playing into a narrative that on some level there was a German complicity in wanting to believe, i.e. Hitler's obsession with the Balkans, or there's the intelligence, apart from being highly creative, utterly bonkers, the kind of way of working through the mindset of the Germans and playing to the strength psychologically, corkscrew thinking, as opposed to German, which was
much more
not
lateral and
very
straightforward. No, you put your finger on a very good point. I mean, the first error of any kind of intelligence is to ask for intelligence corroborating what you already believe. And it was known from intercepted intelligence that Hitler strongly suspected that there would be an attack in the Balkans via Greece, and that the Western Mediterranean was also very vulnerable. So they began the whole deception based on the understanding, and they did this again for D-Day, actually, when it was understood that Hitler believed that the invasions of northern France were going to take place in Calais and not in Normandy, and they began from that assumption. So therefore, if you can, I mean, it is the big danger of intelligence that if you ask your spies to prove something, they will prove it. And I think the Iraq War is a pretty good example of that. You know, if you believe there are weapons of mass destruction and you ask your spies to confirm that there are weapons of mass destruction, that is what they will do. And so I think they began in a way from a position of sort of knowing what Hitler wanted to believe and trying to confirm it, rather than trying to dissuade him from something that he had already decided, if you see what I mean. And that's as you say, in hierarchical organizations, and German intelligence was intensely hierarchical. You know, you did what the boss wanted, whereas British and American intelligence has traditionally been arranged on a much more lateral system, whereby there are checks and balances for everything that comes in, and your colleagues, rather than your bosses, decide whether or not it's right or wrong. You're not told to find something and then it's proven. But the other thing they did, I think, in this deception operation was they tried to think of absolutely everything. I mean, they didn't quite manage it, but they tried to. And there was one example of that was amazed me, actually, was that I thought they had made one important mistake when I was writing this book, which was that one of the letters that William Martin carried with him was a letter from his father, who didn't exist, obviously, telling him about his cousins and what was going on. And it was headed from a particular inn in Wales, the Black Lion in near Cardiff. And when I read that and I found the letter exists in the archives, I thought that's a real hostage to fortune. Because it would only take one German spy to go to the Black Lion in Cardiff and realize that this character, I can't remember what it's called, John Martin, who was supposedly the father of William Martin, none of them existed, had not been in that hotel at that time. It would be very easy to work out that that was a faked letter. Well, blow me down. After the book came out, I got a call from a man saying, I just want you to know I have the hotel register from the Black Lion in Cardiff, and I want you to see it. So I went to Cardiff, and I took a photograph of it. It's in some of the later editions. They'd actually bothered to send somebody to the Black Lion in Cardiff to sign themselves in under a false name on that day, so that just in case there was a German spy in the vicinity who was consulting the hotel register, it would all look right. And that was something I had no idea of when I was writing the book. And it was rather an eerie feeling, actually, to see this false name. And it's in Charles Chumley's handwriting.
Brilliant.
So he clearly went up and pretended and signed in under a false name.
Maybe we should open up for some questions.
Of course, with pleasure. Yes, lovely.
Any questions?
Yes, sir. I can only just hear you. Were there parallel operations going? Yes. Yes. There were. I mean, Operation Mincemeat was one constituent part of a broader operation called Operation Bodyguard, all of which was aimed towards this one overarching deception, to take attention away from Sicily and put it onto these two other targets. So yes, there were lots of other elements to it. And they included double agents feeding misinformation to the Abwehr. They included physical deception. They included assembling a lot of, as I think I said at the beginning, dummy tanks made of plywood and plastic. Inflatable tanks, believe it or not, were assembled on the shores near the embarkation point for Greece that would look as if they were going to attack Greece. The only problem with those was that in high winds they would actually take off. And there are some very funny photographs of British squadrons trying to hold down these rubber inflatable tanks in case they had to nail them down. But yes, no, it was part of a much broader deception plan. But it was really the pivotal part of it. I mean, without Operation Mincemeat, the whole thing would have been much more difficult, I think. And what's clear is that Hitler was so baffled, I think, by the different elements of this, that at the very least he dispersed his forces around the northern Mediterranean. Whereas had he focused them on the obvious target, which was Sicily, it wouldn't have worked out. And the casualties from the invasion of Sicily were astonishingly low. 160,000 men went in by the end of the campaign for Sicily, and there was hard fighting further inland. There was some seriously hardened panzer divisions further inland. It was a brutal fight. The landing was not bloodless exactly, but they lost very few men. And even by the end of the Sicilian campaign, they had lost, I think, only 7,000 men out of 160,000, which was a tiny fraction of what they'd expected. Yes, sir.
I've enjoyed very much your story, and I just a question further with the invasion. The British and Canadian troops were a tough slog. Did the Americans do a deal with the mafia and get right through the country without very much danger at all?
The question is, did the invading troops do a deal with the Sicilian mafia to enable the invasion to succeed? It's long been rumoured. It's a brilliant story. I've never seen any evidence that it's really true that. I wish it were. I mean, the idea that Patton had kind of got into cahoots with, Giuseppe Von Carlo, Capo di Capi, nothing would be more marvellous. But I don't think it's necessarily true. Although, as the invasion of Italy progresses, there is a considerable amount of liaison between different units, American and British and Commonwealth, and black marketeers. I mean, the invading forces become very dependent on the black market, which is, of course, run by the mafia. But whether the mafia was really in a position to enable the invasion to happen even, I don't see how that would really have worked. I mean, short of, sort of assassinating German tank commanders, but there's no evidence that I've ever seen that really happened.
Weren't the Americans given part of the island and then the British Commonwealth and other parts?
Yes, no, there were two different armies, in fact, were used, and they did invade different bits. And there were glider troops went in and parachute troops went in on the interior, and but in effect there were two different campaigns. Yeah, yes. Sorry. This gentleman and then down here.
And then here.
Yes, sir. No, you don't want to ask a question. Someone did there.
Were there any German agents in England to verify the story at all? Or did they just pretty much just go with it and just take it as it was?
The short answer is there was not a single German spy in Britain.
The Germans didn't think so, though.
The Germans, however, thought they had an extremely active network of spies. They'd all been picked up. Again, because of Bletchley Park, every spy that Germany sent to Britain was either captured and executed, the unlucky 14 they were called, or captured and turned and used to send disinformation back to Germany, or captured, imprisoned, and then impersonated. I mean, that was the other thing that MI5 did, was that it would capture somebody, it would then imprison him, or her occasionally, and then they would impersonate them through their radio wireless. So they would work out exactly how they were supposed to recontact the Abwehr, And the other thing they did was to create their own network. So there was a wonderful character called Juan Pujol, who was a sort of failed Spanish chicken farmer, who was Agent Garbo, who arrived in Britain. He pretended to spy for the Germans, and he got himself recruited by the Abwehr, but always intended to spy for the Allies. And he arrived in Britain in about 1942, early 1942, and he created, with the help of MI5, an entire totally fictitious network of other agents, supposedly German sympathizers and fascists who were feeding information back. He ended up with 23 different people who... No, SOE was in occupied Europe. That was really an MI5 and MI6 operation within Britain. But it convinced the Germans that they had a flourishing, highly efficient network in Britain, when in fact they had exactly the reverse of that.
And even the false, non-existent agents had MI5 supervisors watching that it
was incredibly complicated. In fact, they became, again, it's that thing that we were talking about earlier. They worked out what the sort of weaknesses of the other side were. Well, one of them was that the Germans were obsessed with the idea that there were Welsh nationalists prepared to sort of rise up and attack the British government as sort of pro-fascist. There was nothing of the sort. I mean, the Welsh were completely on side with the war, but in order to feed this fantasy, they invented a lot of Welsh fascists. And gave them all fake names and fake backstories, and it was a brilliant act of imagination, really. I realize we don't have long, so your last question, yeah.
Out of all the books that you've written, which one was your favorite to write or research?
I love questions like that. Which is my favorite book to write and research? The one that set me off on this whole story, this sort of strange espionage thing that I'm now sort of locked into, was my first one about spies, which was called Agent Zigzag, which was about as you can probably tell, I'm rather more interested in people who are odd and kind of crooked and roguish. I'm not very interested in one-dimensional heroes. I like people who are strange. And Agent Zigzag was very strange. He was a crook. He was a con man and a burglar and a blackmailer and a pimp. And a charming fellow, extremely handsome and very good fun. And he happened to be imprisoned in Jersey when the Germans invaded the Channel Islands. And he did a deal with the Germans to the effect that if they trained him as a spy and dropped him back into Britain, he would then spy for them instead of the Germans. And this is what they did. They trained him in occupied France in kind of parachuting and explosives and various other bits and pieces. He was going to go in as a saboteur. And he landed in Cambridgeshire in 1941, hit the ground, broke his nose, and immediately defected to MI5 as a double agent. So he said to MI5, I'll spy for you against the Germans, who will think I'm on their side, whereas I'm actually on your side. They called him Agent Zigzag because they were never quite sure whose side he was really on. And right to the end of the war, he brilliantly played both sides against the middle. And survived the war brilliantly. And I find him a fascinating character because although he was a terrible man in all sorts of ways, there was some central element of patriotism and courage to him that was quite extraordinary. And after the end of the war, wonderfully, he went straight back to being a criminal. He was a high-rolling gangster in the 50s and 60s. And then eventually, and this is the most pleasing aspect of all, he became crime correspondent of the Daily Telegraph.
Not the time.
No, good Lord,
No.
No.
Brilliant.
Absolutely not.
We're up for time.
Sorry,
Thank
I've
you so
overrun.
much, Ben.
Thank you very much, guys.